it is my great pleasure to welcome Karuna Mantena to the University of Michigan. As those of you who have seen the flyer for today's talk will know, Karuna is associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Yale. She holds a BSc. She has this amazing background in terms of its breadth. She holds a BSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics, an MA in Ideology and Discourse Analysis from the University of Essex, and a PhD in Government from Harvard. Before joining Yale as an assistant professor in 2005, Karuna also enjoyed a visiting assistant professor appointment at Cornell University. She is the author of what many have already acclaimed as a very important book, Alibis of Empire, Henry Maine and the Ends of Liberal Imperialism, published by Princeton in 2010. In this work, in Alibis of Empire, Karuna makes a compelling argument that there was a crucial shift in imperial ideology in the mid-19th century from being grounded in imperialism to a rejection of it. It's a fabulous book that I had the opportunity to read last semester with my students, and it received critical acclaim, actually, which is something that we should, in a room full of graduate students, is very rare. But in this work, she links this shift in ideology to the rise of indirect forms of colonial rule, enhancing our understanding of this form of imperialism in critical respects. I feel very sure that Karuna is poised to do the same thing again, enhance our understanding in critical respects, that is. Karuna is now working on a book manuscript titled Gandhi's Realism, Means and Ends in Politics. She will be presenting today from this new work. Her talk is entitled Gandhi and the Hazards of Actions, the Lessons of Chaura. Please join me in welcoming Karuna Mantena.
Thank you for a very kind introduction, and thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be in Ann Arbor. I never studied formally at Michigan, but my sister was a graduate student here, and I grew up in Farmington Hills, so it feels like home. So the title of my talk today is Gandhi and the Hazards of Action, the Lessons of Chaura. In 1915, after nearly 21 years of political work on behalf of Indian migrants in South Africa, Gandhi returned to India to immerse himself for the first time in the emergent scene of anti-colonial and nationalist politics. Gandhi's rise to power, as Judith Brown wrote so many years ago, was dramatic. He brought a new vision and style of mass politics, one that diverged sharply from existing coordinates of elite Indian politics. Within 4 short years, Gandhi became the effective leader of a reorganized and revitalized Congress party and commanded the first major mass mobilizations against British rule, the apex of which was the non-cooperation movement. The non-cooperation campaign was envisioned as an explicit experiment in mass nonviolent action. In Gandhi's words, it was part of an attempt to bring satyagraha, quote, into play on a large scale on the political field for the first time. The campaign itself was directly sparked, as many of you will know, by a threefold set of political grievances, a call for the repeal of the Rowlatt Bills, a response to the Amritsar massacre, and the protection of Khilafat. These first satyagraha campaigns, through countrywide boycotts, heartthrows, picketing, and strikes, aimed at, and this is Gandhi's words, quote, a complete severance of the British connections where Indians would, quote, cease to patronize the very institutions that are the emblems of British power and instruments for holding us under subjection. This was in part a top-down program that sought to wean the Western educated elite from supporting institutions that, quote, confirmed English authority. Non-cooperation, therefore, entailed the surrender of honorary titles and offices, the boycott of government functions, schools, and courts, and the withdrawal from civil service, the military, and council elections. The more bottom-up or grassroots platform for mobilization and resistance focused on the boycott of foreign goods, especially imported cloth, and the promotion of khadi. In February 1922, in an atmosphere of growing momentum, Gandhi announced the campaign's escalation in the form of a call for non-payment of land taxes. This, what he took to be the most extreme and potent act of disobedience. But on the very day that the no-tax campaign was to begin, the outbreak of violence at Chauri Chaura in UP brought non-cooperation to a sudden and controversial end. At Chauri Chaura, policemen, after firing upon protesters, were chased into a police station, which was then set alight, leaving 23 dead. Gandhi, through the Congress Working Committee, announced an immediate cessation of mass civil disobedience and began a 5-day fast of atonement and purification. This was a defining moment of Gandhi's political career. No other decision has been so roundly condemned and I want to argue misunderstood. Nehru and many of Gandhi's younger followers who had entered politics for the first time, inspired by the call for direct action, were left angered and frustrated and embittered. To his severest critics, then and now, it seemed to confirm suspicions that the spiritual elements of Gandhian Satyagraha might work to undermine its political usefulness. In fact, there have been, I think, 3 critical interpretations of Gandhi's suspension of non-cooperation. One, as I have just referred to, as a sign of his overriding concern for the ethical purity of nonviolent resistance at the expense of political utility and success. And secondly, another reading is usually that the decision to suspend the movement was stemmed from Gandhi's need and desire for absolute control, a sign of his authoritarian leadership. And thirdly, often linked to the last view, is that Gandhi was concerned that the movement was becoming more radical, in Chauri Chaura in particular, that it was a peasant protest, an agrarian protest, and Gandhi himself wanted to rein in this potential. This is especially, has become in a way the typical Marxist reading that views Gandhian politics as fundamentally reactionary, and so the suspension of non-cooperation is taken as a sign of that. I think in many ways the last 2 readings are probably, they are importantly retrospective readings, and they probably were more based on what in fact was true, as Gandhi did fear, had very deep fears about instigating civil war and violent social revolution, but these were fears that really characterized the anti-colonial movement in the 30s and 40s, and less so in the 20s. But in the context of NCO, I want to argue that Gandhi's decision was motivated less by strict ethical concerns or by these concerns about civil war and social revolution, or indeed the anxiety about control up to a point, but by a series of political calculations about the means appropriate to the ends of Swaraj, or self-rule. Calculations, firstly, of how to mount an effective large-scale resistance without engendering cycles of ineffective militancy, embittered repression, and disillusionment, and also political calculations about what Swaraj was. In Gandhi's terms, it was self-rule in terms of the masses. In this sense, the decision to suspend non-cooperation, I think, yields a very different lesson and different understanding of Gandhi's political thinking. In these first experiments in mass satyagraha, Gandhi dramatically confronted the hazards and possibilities of large-scale political action, and also learned that the temptations of violence in politics might arise from the very nature of mass political action itself. Sorry. Oops. Gandhi famously referred to Chauri Chaura and the series of disturbances that shadowed his initial experiments in large-scale nonviolent protest as his Himalayan miscalculations or blunders. What was it that Gandhi thought he had so radically miscalculated? On the one hand, Gandhi stated that he had been naively optimistic about the readiness of Indians for the demands of civil disobedience. Through his South African experiences, and more crucially in his local experiments at Satyagraha in Champaran, in Kheda, in Ahmedabad in the years just prior to the launching of non-cooperation, Gandhi had grown increasingly confident in the capacity of uneducated and poor workers and peasants to effectively practice Satyagraha, to show restraint in response to provocation, and to demonstrate discipline in enduring economic hardship. This faith in ordinary Indians was also evident in Hind Swaraj, Gandhi's 1909 pamphlet, in which he attributed the appeal of political violence almost exclusively to an elite desire to emulate modern civilization. Chauri Chaura had sharply demonstrated that the temptations of violence ran deeper. In the case of Chauri, Gandhi took the main culprit to be, quote, excitement, a metonym for a more general concern for the passions and dispositions that are roused by political action and contestation. In one sense, popular excitement was linked to the problem of crowds, not only when collective action threatens spontaneous or mob violence, but also when the sheer strength of numbers engenders a collective egoism and sense of corporate power. Gandhi would also discern the appeal of what he called unadulterated excitement amongst radicals and idealists who associated politics with, quote, the clamor for immediate action. In the latter form, militant action, though principled and determined, for Gandhi nevertheless confused the mere agitation for freedom with its achievement. In both versions, for Gandhi, excitement engendered a hubristic politics and tempted one in the direction of an unconstrained politics of escalation. It was the opposite of the kind of patient, restrained, and directed politics of nonviolence he had hoped to instantiate on a mass scale. In this sense, Chauri Chaura and the experience of these first experiments in mass satyagraha mark a pivotal moment in Gandhi's understanding of and critique of political violence and the forms of nonviolent action that could answer and mitigate it. It led him to expand the concerns also in Hind Swaraj about the futility of violence towards a more sustained engagement with the problem of political action. In his concerted engagement with this problem, Gandhi recognized and sought to confront the forms of violence that were seen to be endemic to the dynamics of political contestation. In the wake of Chauri Chaura and the collapse of the non-cooperation movement, Gandhi became acutely sensitive to this problem, to the ways in which political action, especially collective action, held within itself the potential for coercion, escalation, and violence. The larger project of which this talk forms a part is focused is hopefully, when it comes together, a focused meditation on Gandhi's account of political action, of what political action entails, and what it requires if it is to be effective and at the same time avoid the descent into violence. Gandhi's central concern, how to formulate an effective nonviolent politics, I take to be as vital today as when he first proposed it over a century ago. Today, however, Gandhian nonviolence, I think, is more often misconstrued as a static moral injunction against violence or simply a condemnation of violent resistance. Gandhi himself is often portrayed as a saintly idealist, a pacifist, or a purveyor of conviction politics, a moral critic of politics speaking from the standpoint of conscience and truth. Against this image of the saint as politician or the moral man of conscience, I pursue Gandhi's politics from the vantage point of Gandhi, the political actor and innovator, who vividly understood that politics is closely bound to the possibility of violence. This was the core of what I call Gandhi's realism, a view of politics as profoundly shaped by endemic tendencies towards conflict, domination, and violence, coupled with an account of how political action can constrain and mitigate these same tendencies to effect progressive change. Today I'm going to discuss how Chauri Chaura represents a pivot in Gandhi's political thinking and political practice. In the first part of my talk, I'll focus on a shift in Gandhi's understanding of the sources of violence in politics. And the second, I'll turn to an understanding of how Gandhi would reconceive satyagraha to respond to this anxiety about action. And I want to say that this is the moment, the collapse of non-cooperation movement, when Gandhi begins to articulate a program of constructive satyagraha and constructive work. Most discussions of Gandhi's critique of violence, as well as nonviolence, tend to start with Gandhian notions of nonviolence, ahimsa, satyagraha as given, and in a way as a pre-given and almost static idea, and then look at how he applies these ideas, ahimsa, satyagraha, to various political goals and projects towards independence, toward communal harmony, towards caste critique, and how this application inevitably comes up against some limits and contradictions. I want to reorient the question and not start with a definition as such of nonviolence, but ask first what the question or the problem that nonviolence was meant to, what the question or problem was that nonviolence was invented to provide an answer. So in this context, I take the primary question to be something like this: what are the sources of violence in politics? And I hope in reconstructing more carefully this prior question that we can get a better sense of what satyagraha, or nonviolent action, required and entailed in response to that problem. And this, I think, we can focus more on how Gandhi's understandings of violence and nonviolence changed over time, depending on the answer and question, how they're posed. For Gandhi, of course, political life was, in a profound and fundamental sense, closely bound to the problem of violence. At the same time, the sources and consequences of violence in politics were understood by Gandhi to be varied and multiform. The problem of violence was at once metaphysical, moral, and ethical, as well as the part that I want to focus on, distinctly political. What I hope to give a sense of is how, with the deepening of his political experience and expansion of his political vision, Gandhi came to locate and specify ever more precisely the distinct forms that violence assumed in politics and in political interaction. In Gandhi's earliest formulations of satyagraha, in step with his political campaigns in South Africa, satyagraha was seen to offer a radical alternative to the path of violence in politics. In responding to brute force through suffering and returning good for evil, satyagraha was envisioned as a politics of exemplarity. It aimed to demonstrate by example the utility of nonviolence as an alternative mode of redressing wrongs and attaining rights. In these early formulations, Gandhi's deep ethical rejection of violence was closely tied to an underlying worldview that took violence to inhere in modern modes of politics and modern ways of living. The philosophic connection between violence and modern civilization lent Gandhi's early explorations a certain abstract quality, both in terms of the critique of violence and the theory of nonviolence. When Gandhi began to turn his attention to the scene of nationalist politics in India, the critique of political violence was expanded and aimed at demonstrating the strategic and substantive futility of violence. In Hind Swaraj, his first extended defense of nonviolence and first entree into Indian political debates, Gandhi criticized militant nationalism not only for advocating, in his terms, a suicidal policy, but also for favoring political means that oriented nationalism towards the wrong ends, namely elitist and statist political ends. With Gandhi's immersion in Indian politics and what I take to be this dramatic confrontation with the hazards of political action, he became attuned to a third set of issues, the specific forms of violence endemic to the dynamics of action and contestation on a mass scale. Today I'll focus on this last, what I take to be a kind of third phase, and highlight the central role of affect, the central role that affect plays in Gandhi's account of the psychology of violence and escalation. In this context, I take this last form to be, in a way, the most expansive and instructive form of his critique of violence, and satyagraha would emerge in this context not just as an alternative to violence, but as a mode of action that could directly counter and mitigate a violence born from the nature of action and conflict. So, in my view, more schematically then, I take there to be, from Gandhi's early encounter with thinkers like Tolstoy to this first immersion into Indian politics, three sort of overlapping phases of his critique of violence. First, the one that I mentioned, a more abstract level, which was, again, these phases continue, but they change in emphasis. An abstract critique of violence that was very interested in the modern state and institutions of modern state and society as institutions based on force, which was deeply, I think, indebted to a Tolstoyan account of modern civilization. A second worry about the futility of violence, I think that really is captured in Hind Swaraj, which has these two aspects, a critique of a substantive critique of violence, in which terrorism and political violence, militant nationalism, is understood to be an elitist form of action that is looking forward to an elitist form of politics, a statist politics that, of course, as you know, the iconic phrase merely wants an English rule without the Englishman. And doesn't yet substantively involve a vision of Swaraj in which the masses themselves could realize their own self-rule. And the second part of that, which is the part I want to focus on, is the strategic futility of violence. So the second aspect that I think you can find in Hind Swaraj but becomes much more important throughout the 20s is that the root of political violence would be strategically futile. It engendered cycles of ineffective militancy, repression, disillusionment, and I think this was the basis of the tactical argument that grounded Gandhi's suspension of non-cooperation. I want to spend some time drawing out this strategic objection to violence, which I call political because it involves it's strategic and consequential in a distinctive way. So Gandhi's worry about the futility of violence, the idea that violence might be a suicidal policy, I think concerns, in this sense, more than just the moral illegitimacy of violence. It opens up questions about the possible cyclical and escalating dynamics of violence, and therefore broader concerns about the practical limitations of political violence. And in that sense, these larger concerns about the problems of political contestation. For Gandhi, contestation as such was an interactive and iterative process, which characteristically proceeds through chains of action, reaction, and counter-reactions. Though the appeal to violence is often tied to a hope that the chain of action will come to an end with one last show of force that can secure a final peace, in practice, violence bred resentment and further resistance. For Gandhi, then, a key fact of political action and interaction is the forms of resistance and recalcitrance that are endemic to the dynamic of contestation. They are the unintended but foreseeable consequences of all political action. For Gandhi, this was especially acute in the case of violence, for in being an absolute, irreversible deed, violence initiates definite dynamics of resentment, retrenchment, and retaliation, a dynamic that often is prosaically referred to as a cycle of violence. The choice of violent or coercive means, therefore, would necessarily affect the terms and nature of conflict, where extreme or confrontational means could easily exacerbate the tendency towards polarization, heightened conflict, and entrenchment. Gandhi's worry about consequences, entailments, and effects of action was closely tied to a concern about the negative passions and dispositions that both enable and are enabled by the dynamics of conflict. To speak of the ways in which violence or coercion or contestation expectedly leads to forms of entrenchment, resentment, and hostility is to call attention to the central role of affect in political life and the moral psychology of violence. Gandhi was especially attuned to this particular dimension and took passions such as pride and egoism and their derivatives such as anger, ambition, humiliation, insolence, revenge, retaliation, etc., to be key forces for understanding the structure and psychology of violence and escalation. Understanding the role of affect in Gandhi's theory of politics, I think, can help bring to the fore the distinctly political dimensions of what is usually regarded as an ethical critique of violence. So, for example, one of Gandhi's objections to violence was stated in terms of a problem about a claim to infallibility. So, in Gandhi's words, Satyagraha, quote, excludes the use of violence because man is not capable of knowing the absolute truth and therefore not competent to punish. Gandhi's objection here is often construed as an epistemological critique of violence, founded upon a conception of truth as many-sided. Truth for Gandhi was absolute and universal. Indeed, it served as another name for God. At the same time, Gandhian truth lacked any positive, substantive definition. It was a name for an absolute that was in principle unknowable and inaccessible in any final or total sense. Thus, insistence upon it went hand in hand with a view of truth as necessarily many-sided. Each individual not only had their own path to truth, but their knowledge of it was only ever partial and always liable to be mistaken. To recognize fallibility was to accept that people's partial views of justice will necessarily conflict. Quote, for what appears to be truth to the one may appear to be error to the other, And this was for Gandhi, quote, the main reason why violence is eliminated in satyagraha. The satyagrahi, the nonviolent actor, Gandhi continued, quote, gives his opponent the same right of independence and feelings of liberty that he reserves to himself, and he will fight by inflicting injuries on his own person. The concern to respect the freedom, individuality, and integrity of one's opponent is, of course, a central feature of the ethical basis of nonviolence. It was also politically consequential, for it was meant to work to mitigate the resentments that conflict rouses. The posture of infallibility assumed in violence not only denies this kind of freedom, it also itself depends on a heightened sense of subjective certainty. So I think importantly, the posture of infallibility was also understood by Gandhi to be a moral psychological one, a problem of pride and at the same time of weakness and cowardice. Violence deforms both the actor and the opponent. It escalates tension and tempts one in the direction of irreversible violence. The extreme irreversibility of violence demands hubris in its undertaking and in its continued justification, a precarious subjective orientation that made acknowledging errors of judgment and policy reversals difficult and rare. For Gandhi, the fortitude that accompanies violence was a brittle posturing, a papering over of ego-driven investments. The militant Hindu, quote, who will protect by force of arms a few cows but make away with the butcher, or the militant nationalist, quote, who in order to do supposed good to his country does not mind killing off a few officials, are actuated by hatred, cowardice, and fear. Here, love of the country or here, love of the cow or the country is a vague thing intended to satisfy one's vanity or soothe a stinging conscience, unquote. Conviction here is psychologically motivated by a need to project and protect oneself, betraying an egoism grounded in weakness rather than, in Gandhi's terms, a genuine and detached commitment to truth. In Gandhi's account of interaction, then, the problem of pride or hubris had distinct and foreseeable political implications. Implications that were almost always unintended, yet just as certain to exacerbate the dynamics of escalation. In Hind Swaraj, Gandhi offered the following parable to outline the manner in which a response to injustice can easily lead to an escalation that undoes the conditions of a just resolution. In this example, the dynamic of confrontation begins with a thief illegitimately stealing your property. In response, you, full of anger, resolve to punish the thief who has stolen from you, quote, not for your own sake, but for the good of your neighbors. You organize an armed band to counterattack. The thief responds defiantly and, quote, collects his brother robbers and pesters your neighbors, who complain that the robber has only resorted to open threats against them after you declared hostilities against him. You feel badly that you have exacerbated the situation, but feel trapped. Knowing you will be, quote, disgraced if you now leave the robber alone, you instead distribute arms to all your neighbors, quote, and so the battle grows. The result of wanting to take revenge upon the robber is that you have disturbed the peace. You are in perpetual fear of being robbed and assaulted. Your courage has given place to cowardice, end quote. One of the overt lessons of this story is that improper means chosen to respond to injustice can lead to unintended and deleterious consequences, more violence, injustice, and instability. But the parable also shows how the investment in and motivation for seeking justice and redress is imbricated in the agent's sense of self, such that this investment itself becomes a vehicle for escalation and a barrier to reaching a lasting and just resolution. The attachment to principle, perversely, becomes more important as the consequences become negative or less tangibly beneficial, and principled conviction functions as an alibi for a violence born of weakness. Egoistic attachments to principles of this nature were, for Gandhi, a characteristic flaw of political idealism. Quote, to serve the noblest of causes, political idealism becomes susceptible to taking and legitimating, quote, short, violent cuts to success. The psychological temptation to use any and all available means for even small or temporary gains seemingly becomes greater in proportion to one's belief in and attachment to ends. As in the parable of the thief, the dynamic may actually function in the reverse. That is, it might be precisely because the gains are small or non-existent, or even negative and deleterious, that insisting on the rightness of principles becomes ever more politically urgent. In either case, the exaltation of ends becomes all too easily implicated in the justification of various forms of political coercion. More subtly, Gandhi implied that the manner in which ends are evoked, presented, and insisted upon can itself engender resistance. That is, it may prove counterproductive to the process of converting natural opponents to the cause of reform. At the extreme, an uncompromising insistence on ideals may not only lead to the use of coercion, but may well slide into a moralistic politics of conviction or ideological dogmatism, which for Gandhi was especially liable to breed contempt and engender a logic of escalation. Some of Gandhi's earliest interpreters understood surprisingly clearly this moral psychological element and the implications of the moral psychology that underlay the theory and practice of satyagraha. Richard Gregg's widely influential The Power of Nonviolence from 1935 was one of the very first attempts to analyze and present Gandhian models in a systematic fashion to a Western audience. But I think even more impressively and important was Reinhold Niebuhr's analysis of Gandhi's method in Moral Man and Immoral Society in 1932. It was a sharper and more provocative reading than Gregg's, and one that, in terms of its orientation, was far closer to Gandhi's concerns regarding the egoistic dimensions of political conflict. Coming back to the moment of Chauri Chaura, in the violence that shadowed these first experiments, I think when Gandhi discerned the work of excitement, it was an excitement he thought that unleashed, the excitement that unleashed violence and anarchy was at one level a sign of the power of the crowd or the mob. In Gandhi's words, protesters, quote, liked and loved excitement, and underneath these vast demonstrations was an idea unconsciously lurking in the breast that it was a kind of demonstration of force, unquote. In this sense, for Gandhi, one of the central dilemmas of mass action was that it was bred by a collective egoism or self-expansion grounded in a sense of corporate power. Collective hubris, in turn, threatened to unleash a kind of limitless politics, a politics unconstrained by any inhibition towards violence and impatient to demonstrate its newly felt power. Here, the real and recurring hazard of collective action was a temptation to violence that was enabled by and depended upon a perversion or deformation of individual conscience and integrity. For it was through the immersion in a collective energy and sense of power that the ethical coordinates and constraints of individual moral life begin to fray. Gandhi's response was to imagine ways that individualization could be inserted into the dynamics of mass action, where mass action functioned not through the power of numbers per se, but by the coordinated activity of disciplined individuals whose individuality would be maintained and expressed in their comportment, constraint, discipline, and detachment. If mass action could be given such an individuating structure, it would neither depend nor incite collective egoism. Beyond the problem of crowds, the problem of excitement was also evident in the impatient idealism of militant and radical nationalism, where the coincidence or commingling of principle and violence was for Gandhi sustained by corrupting forms of self-righteousness, vanity, and egoism. Excitement and impatience here is akin to what 18th century thinkers termed the problem of enthusiasm, a disposition that functioned to undo, again, the inhibition against violence. While worries about enthusiasm traditionally were sometimes associated with the problem of crowds, again in terms of the superstition, fury, and contagion of popular sentiments that underlay collective disorder, it more often pointed to the problem of certainty and dogmatism. Enthusiasm as a political problem was originally connected in Western political thought to the problem of religious dogmatism, and especially attributed to the individualized and seditious spiritualism of Protestant sects, who had counterposed certain internal and immediate knowledge of God's will to the authority of law and government. This was again the 16th and 17th century problem. By the end of the 18th century, enthusiasm as a term of political criticism had become widely applied to a variety of secular forms of immoderation, intellectual fanaticism, and extreme political partisanship. Indeed, enthusiasm in its secular form would be most sharply associated with dogmatic political ideology and revolutionary ambition. Gandhi's worry about excitement, I think, can be linked to a similar concern about the absolute conviction that accompanies the enactment and justification of violence, a godlike certainty whose moral psychological implication is hubris, pride, and egoism. For Gandhi, radicals and militants of all stripes associated political action with continuous agitation and excitement, and impatient for immediate results that confused the demand for justice with its achievement. Here, the problem of passion and enthusiasm is closely linked to the problem of idealism, where the certainty and the rightness of ends works to enable, justify, or redeem the use of dubious political means. In the wake of Chauri Chaura and the collapse of the non-cooperation movement, Gandhi sought ways to temper the temptations of violence given in excitement. Part of the solution was tied to the development of better forms of organization and leadership that could coordinate mass resistance and enforce discipline. But more crucially, Gandhi would insist on a vigilant and tight imbrication between means and ends, where expectations are disciplined by tethering them to real, concrete, constructive, and cumulative forms of political action. Specifically, Gandhi was concerned to find concrete methods and practices that could train the masses as well as the elites in the disciplining of the passions, and thereby stem the pull of egoism, especially the egoism of frustrated power and the experience of disappointment, humiliation, and resentment. Here, the most important antidote to the intoxications of political action was sought in the immersion in constructive work and activity, where constructive work would offer training in self-rule as well as cultivate patience in industry as a protection against passion and anger. So here I just want to say a few words about the constructive program and what Gandhi called constructive satyagraha. At one level, the constructive program was central to Gandhi's substantive account of Swaraj. Gandhi would repeatedly dissociate true Swaraj from mere independence or the attainment of formal sovereignty. Such external forms would only become meaningful when gained through what he called internal transformation. Quote, Swaraj is not going to descend on us from the heavens. It cannot be received as a gift from the British Empire either. It can only be the reward of our own efforts, unquote. It ultimately depended, quote, on a real awakening of the people, which only could succeed through activities directed inwards. Constructive work the constructive program was to be a vehicle for the curing of India's ills internal to the social life of the incipient nation. This was essential in Gandhi's terms of making Indians fit for Swaraj. From its inception, then, the agenda of the constructive program, which Gandhi insisted on throughout his political career, included three central pillars: the forging of Hindu-Muslim unity, the elimination of untouchability, and the promotion of khadi, or homespun cloth. The agenda of Swaraj often would be formulated in Gandhi's terms as a project of construction, associated variously with terms like constructive work, constructive satyagraha, constructive nonviolence, in which constructive work and action would play a dual role, firstly as experimentation and education in self-rule, especially for the peasant millions. This was that aspect which I alluded to earlier of Gandhi's anti-elitist understanding of Swaraj, where Swaraj was to be more than, he would say, a change of masters only, and had to, in some sense, reinvent or redirect agency to the ordinary Indian. And secondly, constructive work was also understood, and I think more directly connected to the problem of action, as a mode of localized action that would mitigate, channel, and suppress the temptations and tendencies toward political violence. So if we take the example of Khadi, the Khadi program was in many ways the heart of the constructive program. The underlying ideology of the Khadi program was tied, of course, to the nationalist economic critique of colonialism and charged British rule with deindustrialization and the drain of wealth from colony to metropole. But Khadi, so in one sense, Gandhi thought of Khadi as a solution to rural poverty and unemployment, and a response to the problem of a colonial economy. But Khadi was also offered as a model for cultivating self-rule or self-constraint. Here, what was most interesting and elusive was how Gandhi sought to tie the act of spinning itself with the creation of Swaraj. Khadi and Charka, the spinning wheel for Gandhi, intimated a nonviolent structure of rule and authority. Khadi was an exemplary model of a large-scale, decentralized, voluntary enterprise, a mode of cooperation that was collective in nature, but also premised on the patient work of isolated individuals, where each and every individual could separately cultivate discipline and experience self-rule. In Gandhi's words, quote, "Through Khadi, we teach the people the art of civil obedience to an institution which they have built up for themselves, and thereby train the masses in self-consciousness and the attainment of power." But notice it was a power that was individuated, almost radically individuated in structure. Moreover, spinning was intended as a universal practice, an equalizing practice that traversed distinctions of high and low and rich and poor. Gandhi called for Congress leaders especially to take the lead in daily spinning, to demonstrate service to and egalitarian solidarity with the laboring rural poor. Gandhi was so enamored with the broad-ranging moral and political effects of Khadi that he attempted to institute a spinning franchise, famously, did not take hold, to make daily spinning a prerequisite for Congress office holding. Gandhi's resolute insistence on the importance of the constructive program and constructive work was met with equally insistent skepticism and often outright resistance. The main charge was that constructive work was essentially non-political or apolitical, a social agenda that was distracting Gandhi and the national movement from the real political work of resistance to British rule. Gandhi's more severe critics also thought its very substance was traditionalist and backward-looking, or worse still, merely a vehicle for propagating his faddish spiritual politics on a national scale. From the 30s onwards, socialists began to argue that as a program of social and economic reform, the promotion of khadi and cottage industry was too piecemeal and small-scale to effect far-reaching economic renewal, especially for overcoming class exploitation and caste oppression. For many, both within and outside the Congress fold then, the core connection between spinning and Swaraj that Gandhi insisted upon was neither obvious nor necessary. At the same time, people like Nehru, left-leaning modernists within Congress, lauded the Khadi program in their own terms. For them, its main function was as a kind of mass contact program, the means to make the case for Congress amongst the peasantry and to bring them into the cause of national independence. In this way, those closest to Gandhi would invest in the symbolic implications of Khadi and constructive work, but did not see these as intrinsic to constructive action or the substance of Swaraj. At issue in part were divergent senses of the meaning of politics and political action. For Gandhi, constructive work was not primarily a symbolic politics or an ideological project that would prepare the ground for national unity. Rather, it was the actual substance of politics. In his words, it's a long quote, "Constructive work is the basis for solving political problems. Opinions may differ on whether this means the spinning wheel or some other activity, but the time is drawing near when there will be a general agreement that the true solution of political problems lies in the education of the people. This education does not imply mere literacy, but an awakening of the people from their slumber. The people should become aware of their own condition. Such awareness is possible only through public works and not through talks. This does not also mean that every outward agitation is useless, but outward agitation cannot be given the first place. It is of subsidiary importance, and it depends for its success entirely on the success of that which is internal, namely constructive work." As experiments in an education for self-reliance, Gandhi understood constructive work in terms of self-consciousness as opposed to national consciousness. Its substance was not the cultivation of duty to the national project as much as regaining the power of action. For Gandhi, the educated elite, the impatient youth, and political radicals tended to equate politics and political action too easily with the, quote, "the clamor for unadulterated excitement," with the immediate capture of political office and power. They were, quote, "addicted to the politics of speeches, resolutions, declarations, of cultivating and exciting public opinion, and therefore shunned the solid and silent work of construction upon which the moral and political revolution of the masses depended." Crucially for Gandhi, sustained constructive work was also important as a bulwark against excitement and incitement, against the harboring of resentments and impatience that tempts one in the direction of political violence. And in this respect, like the act of spinning itself, the imperative to constructive work was meant as a universal pedagogy. a remedy for both the political elite as well as the masses. On the one hand, quote, we want the people to become immersed in industries and constructive activities so that their temper is not exposed to the constant danger of being ruffled, unquote. On the other hand, absorption in common constructive work will, quote, steady and calm us. It will wake our organizing spirit. It will make us fit for Swaraj. It will cool our blood, unquote. The act of spinning again exemplified in miniature a practical and immersive exercise that cultivated patience, industry, simplicity as both an experience of self-rule and as a protection against passion and anger. Against the militants, Gandhi argued that the frenzied call for resistance and disobedience for something as broad and abstract as independence, quote, without the cooperation of the millions by way of constructive effort is mere bravado and worse than useless, unquote. Likewise, against the socialists, he's contended that, quote, those who play upon the passions of the masses injure them and the country's cause. Agitation against every form of injustice is the breath of political life, but my contention is that divorced from the constructive program, it is bound to have the tinge of violence. For Gandhi, then, the self was the center of action. The self was deeply implicated in action, both in terms of gaining internal power, the power of action, as well as in forestalling the psychological temptations and erosions that led to violence. In the case of civil disobedience and non-cooperation, that is in negative or destructive satyagraha, which I haven't spoken much about, Gandhi thought self-limiting action worked when it mitigated the resentments that action entailed, most importantly by taking upon itself the burdens and consequences of action. In constructive satyagraha, self-limiting action attempts to undercut psychological impulses like impatience, bravado, self-righteousness, and dogmatism through the self-conscious cultivation of trust and authority through work and service. Abstract ends such as Swaraj needed grounding in immediate, intimate, and precise practices, such as spinning, as a way to ward off the temptation to look for what Gandhi liked to call short, violent cuts in politics, for psychologically satisfying but ultimately self-defeating gains. So in sum, Gandhi attempted to create and practice modes of political action, especially in their collective form, that could undercut egoistic and hubristic politics and mitigate cycles of violent escalation. Understanding Gandhi's anxieties about political action, I think, helps to make sense of why Gandhi has so often been labeled and dismissed as utopian and conservative and reactionary in the same breath. Gandhi, I think what was innovative was Gandhi combined a conservative stance against violence and deep conservative anxieties about mass and popular action, but he combined this with an insistent and intense program of progressive change. He was deeply influenced in a way, by the anti-political views or the views that are suspicious of politics. He learned this from people that he admired, like Thoreau, Emerson, Tolstoy, and Tagore, who worried about the deforming effects of mass politics, the dangers of conformity, the constraints of party and movement to individuality, and the seductive pull of self-expansive egoism, the power of numbers in a democratic age. But Gandhi was unique, unlike these forebearers and interlocutors, in his willingness to engage and experiment with mass action and attempt to invent the terms and conditions in which it might overcome these inherent dangers. I'll end there.
You'll take questions, I hope.
Yes, I'm going to grab, I found a pen.
We're going to start in the back. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, for that. Sure. Thank you very much for that wonderful and enlightening lecture. I'd like your thoughts on how relevant Gandhi's philosophy would be today. Now, I take no position one way or the other, but assuming, let's say, the 47%, or with the income gap, really 90% were against 5% who control so much more of the wealth in our country. What, other than saying boycotting Nike because of their slave shops or whatever, what would be Gandhi's approach to handling a divisive Congress that doesn't respond to anything but special interests and corporations increasingly? in your professional judgment?
I mean, I think actually, I mean, Gandhi, I think for a lot of reasons was, Gandhian politics was anti-statist in orientation. So I think his vision, as such, would be in relation to building a large-scale social movement of some kind that I think that both calls for and has a vision of what change ought to be strived for, but I think also that in its very organization actually enacts it. So I think in some ways the Occupy movement was deeply Gandhian in some forms because it, I think some of the ways it attempted to, at a small scale, tried to come up with what I think Gandhi would call constructive work, whether it's about dealing at the local level with foreclosures or thinking through certain actions that both were civil. I think, so Gandhi would probably want more discipline and more focus and better, you should wear your Sunday church clothes as they did in the, so there was a lot about comportment that I think Gandhi thought mattered not only for perception, but that it was a part of making, but it was part of mitigating what naturally, and this is what Niebuhr noted too, is that any sort of social movement will always be decried by entrenched classes as being criminal in form or being disruptive, and is easily dismissed if it in fact takes on the face of disruption. So what made, I think what Niebuhr thought and Gandhi thought too, that's why you need discipline as the face of any sort of movement, and it could only become more radical if it appeared to be disciplined. But I think the key would be that you have to enact in local and small ways the larger project. So I think if there were, so I think the Gandhian version partially would really depend on whether local communities could come up with ways to overcome something like local debt crises, local environmental degradation, to show as an example that would link to a larger movement. So I think that's one version. I don't think it's necessarily the only version, because I do think there may be other ways in which to think about the problem of polarization. I mean, and I think of compromise. I think probably the problem, I mean, I'll just say very quickly because we don't necessarily need a whole discussion on my views of contemporary American politics, but I think there's a way in which we associate and maybe practice a politics of moderation and compromise in a way that isn't Gandhian. I mean, that's in a way, I think Gandhi's ideas was that you worked toward moderation, but in a very militant way. So you don't start with positions of compromise, you work toward them. And so you had to figure out a way not to, so compromise could never be a demonstration of weakness. And that's the trick of how you can, from a weak position, build up enough moral strength to therefore compromise in a way that actually moves towards a resolution. So,
Tom, would you mind waiting for the mic for 1 second up in the front? Sorry, that's the only way of recording the discussion.
Thank you very much, Karuna, for a wonderful explication of the Chauri Chaura reversal of non-cooperation. Very startling event for sure. And I think it's a very convincing explication of what that's all about. I was wondering, since Satyagraha began in South Africa, why this kind of coming up against a Himalayan blunder
right. Didn't happen
hadn't
earlier.
occurred earlier,
Yeah.
or maybe it had. I mean, of course, the difference of scale, much smaller scale in terms of the following and even the objectives were not Swara, it was not independence.
Yeah.
But I wonder what your thoughts are about that. Maybe there's some hints of it that I don't know about that you do.
Yeah, no, I think it is a question of scale. I think there's only one moment in the South Africa campaigns. I mean, most of the South Africa campaigns, you could count the number of satyagrahis with 3 or 4 hands. You know, they were very small scale, except for the last one, which included the Great March, and for the first time, it included the issue of indentured labor and included indentured laborers in the struggle. And I think Gandhi gets a sense there, at least, again, you can read it in Satyagraha in South Africa, which he wrote, of course, after non-cooperation. So he wrote it both these books, The Experiments with Truth and Satyagraha in South Africa, he wrote after this moment of the failure of non-cooperation, to think through the origins of Satyagraha. So, but I think the only moment that you get is he does recognize during the march the sense of the power of numbers for the first time, that there is something that could be compulsive. And I think he has a sense of the fear of the power of numbers as well, and that it could easily get out of control. So I think he has a sense of it, but it's nothing like the experience in India. And you know, the Chauri Chaura comes as sort of the straw that breaks the camel's back after each, you know, the Rowlatt Satyagraha ends with violence. I mean, all of them, he calls off, they get called off. Violence is continuously insurgent, and so it's only Chauri Chaura that he finally stops and thinks this isn't just going to go away, so you have to stop and think about what actually the structure of action can be that wouldn't necessarily lead to this. I mean, it is a sort of cycle, because I think the original, I mean, in a way, his model, and if you think of Thoreau, the model of civil disobedience had always been individual, and it was individual for a purpose, because in some ways, Thoreau and others were very suspicious of the power of numbers. So Gandhi comes back to that through this experience in some way, I think.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was particularly struck by your emphasis on affect and psychology. And I thought that was particularly interesting because the anti-colonial thinker who we normally associate with that perspective is Fanon. Who of course comes to a diametrically opposite conclusion about violence. So I wondered, first of all, if you emphasize that perspective deliberately to draw that contrast. And secondly, I'm wondering if you have any idea what the sources of Gandhi's psychology are. Is he influenced at all by Western psychology, by crowd psychology, which was sort of an implicit theme of your discussion, or by the Victorian psychology of a thinker like Spencer, who emphasizes discipline in many ways? Thanks.
Yeah, no, I mean, the first question, I think Fanon is I think they're similar in some regards, and I think what makes them similar, I mean, obviously I think there's more, I'd say I'm not entirely convinced that Fanon is advocating violence as much as he describes why violence is an understandable, automatic, necessary reaction in the context of colonial violence. So I think of him more as a sociologist, an existential sociologist who's describing why violence appears, but it's also not entirely clear to me that he thinks it's a solution. It's still a problem of what that violence will do. But I think actually what is actually similar and interesting is, you know, in a way the debates in the 50s and 60s about national liberation are concerned about figuring out a popular mode of anti-colonialism that is also anti-elitist in certain ways and very critical of a nationalist comprador takeover of the anti-imperial project. And I think that's very similar to the Gandhian moment. And the Gandhian moment is much earlier, and so it's not, in a way, it precedes the kind of moment of national liberation. So therefore, it in a way, there's a space in the 1920s where Gandhi can posit a populist mode, an anti-elitist mode, which is very different from the Marxist model, but isn't different in at least that sense that it's meant also to be anti-nationalist in that way and anti-elitist. So I think that's also similar. But the moral psychology, I have to think, I mean, I think a lot of it is actually Gandhi's I think a lot of it is his understanding of Hinduism and Buddhism. So I think there's a psychology of the self that is very much takes an account of, in a way, the account of the overcoming of ego's attachments to body and self. I think that's the psychology that he works out, and I think it actually, when he directs it in the political sphere, I think it's much more. It's a very interesting analog of, again, I think he ends up with a kind of critique of moralism and a critique of idealism, which is why I put him in a realist camp, which I think makes him sound very different from what we associate Gandhianism with, which is an absolute commitment to conviction in the face of all odds. And I think that view and that's the kind of classic view of the civil disobedience, Socrates, et cetera. And I think actually Gandhi's wasn't, he doesn't quite use the word conscience in the same way and with the same repetition as Thoreau and others do. And I think it's partially because so I think the ontology of the self is different, and the psychology is very much, I think, derived more from Indian sources in that way. But again, Gandhi's Indian sources they're always a little bit vague. So it's not, it'd be hard to point to a singular text that it would be his interpretation of I think, a certain kind of model of tapas and self-realization through discipline. So.
Madhav in the front.
With the rise of Gandhi in politics, what we find is those guys who were following Tilak's ideology, for example, were gradually pushed out of Congress. And eventually people like Subhash Chandra were pushed out. And so there is a kind of a counter view of what Gandhi was doing.
Yeah.
And so there's a perception that Gandhi had a public face and a private sort of cunning politician side to him. And so I wonder whether we have any record of sort of private conversations of Gandhi with Nehru or Patel or anyone that give us some sort of not the sort of this standard ideology of Gandhi that we are familiar with, but then there is like a whole another calculating politician behind this.
I mean, I think there's very little of what Gandhi said and did that's not in the public record. And so it's 100 volumes and counting, and it's there in a lot of diaries. I think there's it's based on, it's an interpretation of this existing record. There's no question that Gandhi schemed to, not just, whether you call it scheming, he outright campaigned and petitioned to get Subhash Chandra Bose unelected or to get him to resign. So all of that was open, and so obviously the deeper question is this against Gandhian principles, and it's hard to say because it's obviously Gandhi himself didn't think it was. He thought he was straightforwardly trying to persuade all of the Congress Working Committee, and obviously it was using coercion. The question of whether coercion, Gandhi himself relied on all sorts of coercion. Of course, in practice, it was the case, and many, of course, the fast that Ambedkar felt was coercive. Those are all, I think, things that you can't clear Gandhi from that legitimate critique. But I think so. Gandhi, in his own terms, though, I think did try, at least in the terms of satyagraha, did try to, I think, conceptualize satyagraha in such a way that he did think it could function non-coercively. This is a long-standing debate in Gandhian politics, whether coercion is absolutely necessary, and the realist, sort of the Gandhian realists like Niebuhr and Sridharan, and the whole school will say moral coercion is okay. That's what satyagraha is all about. But I think those interpretations, the problem with them is they also accept that collective power is okay if it works through the threat of force. And I think whether Gandhi can be consistent or not entirely it's not clear, but I think conceptually he was trying to find a model of action which didn't depend on coercion and force as such. And whether he was successful is still whether he could actually come up with a situation that was entirely divorced of coercion is not clear. But I think that was the goal. So I mean, I think he was manipulative in those dealings, but I don't think it was personal and cliquish, which is the other, that it was, there were specific reasons why he thought Subhash Chandra Bose wasn't the right leader at the time, which this debate wouldn't happen very cleanly in Bengal anytime soon.
Lee, did you have a question?
Yeah, well, you sort of answered some of my concern, and that had to do with fasting and other ways of getting it. And I think, I mean, for me, one of the problems in the discussion generally, but also your thing is in dealing with Chaura, I mean, immediately he fasts.
Yeah.
Does something, immediately he fasts. He wants something, he's always fasting,
Yes.
and that's taken as something separate
Yes.
from these other techniques.
Yeah, yeah.
And especially if you're going to portray him as a realist, this seems, you know, anyway. So you would admit some, you know, some problem there, which I suppose everybody who looks at him has to admit. But I wonder how this affects the larger framework of your argument. I don't know whether you care what Gandhi would think about your analysis, but just distinguishing between idealism and realism in terms of political action. You know, while I can appreciate how that fits in terms of, you know, current arguments in, you know, in your field and other fields, even in activist fields, in some sense, it seems opposed to other aspects of Gandhi's view of things, where one does not want to make that distinction, and where we're reifying some kind of opposition, where, you know, precisely the means are the ends. And truth is this funny kind of thing that's not quite absolute, but it's always present. So I don't know. It's just the terms of the argument are such that seem a little bit at odds with the message you're trying to get to. The other little thing, just a comment in relation to the fasting and things like that. The way you characterize Gandhi's understanding of violence is that it's something absolute and irreversible.
The deed.
The deed, yeah. Well, the fast until death seems to partake of that. And so,
absolutely,
And so there's just almost, you know, a two-sidedness, or, you know, in the end itself, and that, you know, I want some room for that.
I think the fasting question is an important one, and so I think in the larger sense, what satyagraha is a more multifaceted account of techniques and stances that are dynamic, and so I think they really do change in structure depending on the relationship between the political actors. I mean, Ajay Skaria has written about this in terms of satyagraha taking on a different phase between if your opponent is superior, so that's civil disobedience. If your opponent, if it's a kind of equality or an attempted equality, it's friendship, and if it's towards a subaltern, it's seva or service. I think there's something right to it. So in Gandhi's fasts, all of them, you know, he never he officially. I mean, he said very clearly. Again, I think the Pune fast is the one very clear exception where he always said, you never fast against an opponent, because an opponent will only feel this as blackmail. You can't have fast against Dwyer or Dwyer. You can't fast against a tyrant. It would be felt as nothing but blackmail. So he never fasted against the British government as such, or any British officer. There's one thing I have to check about one policeman, but he always fasted, as he would say, you fast against those who you are in a relationship of love with, your followers, and those whose consciences can be quickened by your sacrifice. So, you know, fasting after Chauri Chaura was in relation to stopping his avowed followers, he would say, and most of his fasts were, you know, in the ashram and similarly, so I think, so that I don't know what it fits in the Ajay Skaria 3 thing, but I think there is he makes this distinction between these are general relations, those who you are an opponent with or place yourself in an opposition with, and those who you are in a relationship of love. And I think he thinks those, you can demand a great deal more from those who conceive of themselves in a familial, domestic, follower relationship. Again, these aren't necessarily things you want to approve of, but it does mean that the kinds of demands he would place on his workers were so much higher than, so in the question of caste, obviously what he demanded of people who were avowed Gandhians or following the constructive program was a much more radical critique of untouchability than obviously what he would argue against Orthodox Hindus. And so there was, I think, there was a diversity of what he thought you needed and how you argued, depending on the context of political action and the context of interaction. That's what I take to be a kind of realism in the structure of understanding that action takes place within context and from standpoints that everyone comes from a distinct standpoint, and one has to reach out to that standpoint in order to come to a new kind of political position. So I think fasting is an interesting model of satyagraha, and I think it's integral to that model. But most of it, there's only one fast which he thinks he inadvertently, he doesn't ever admit Pune as being that, but the Ahmedabad fast is being the one he regrets because he feels like he ended the labor strike. The reason the labor strike ended is because his opponents supposed to be for the workers, but the opponent, the industrialists actually gave in. So he thought that was blackmail, and that was not supposed to be a technical. That's not the rule of a satyagraha fast. So I think, but I think on the question of idealism, I think Gandhi uses the term practical idealism, and he uses it specifically to say that his idealism is intensely practical, meaning it links means and ends. So I don't think he uses the term he definitely doesn't use the term realism, but I think importantly, I think it is important that his argument, he's not arguing against, most typically, he's not arguing against kind of a power politics or Machiavellian view. Who he's arguing with are, who he takes to be, in a way, unreal idealists. He takes everyone in that context. His argument with Jinnah, his argument with the militant nationalists of the earlier phase and the socialists in the later phase are that he doesn't criticize any of them for being power politicians. He thinks that they have an unreal expectation in some form. And so, again, so in that way, I don't think he himself he's not always comfortable with an idealism label. Sometimes he is. He thinks obviously we always have to aim for the best, but I think he thinks you can't be that aim can't be distracting, and it can't be specified because you can only work out the.
You don't see a way of avoiding the dichotomy.
I don't think so, because I think the problem is that if you collapse means and ends entirely, which is one way that I think a lot of people interpret Gandhi, and I think it's right. In some ways, he does think that every means has to embody its end, but I think he also says, and this is sort of the debate, say, with Nehru on the economic policy. Nehru is always like, well, we need to specify more clearly what the project of land reform is going to do. It should be clear what our radical vision is. And Gandhi's point was always that, and in that thing, you say, we may agree on the ends, but we disagree on how to get there. And he would say, if you specify the ends, if you worry too much endlessly about the ends, then all you do is alienate everyone around you. So what you should do is, as he would say, preserve the means as they are now, and they'll slowly lead you there. So I think sometimes he does allow for a kind of strategic. There has to be some strategic difference between means and ends. There has to be adjustments depending on how your political opponent reacts. So I think that's where you get just a little bit, but I think I don't think it's so apart that it becomes a purely instrumental relationship between them, but I think you can have a little bit more. That's part of a larger argument that takes a lot longer for me to say, but I think it is mostly exemplary, but there is a little bit more, there's something more interesting about it that can be, I think, more widely understood. But.
Hi, thanks for the paper. I was just wondering, from my understanding, there's also, Gandhi also had an idea or a commitment to a kind of autonomy, so like a village level, village community autonomy, and that a kind of morality would kind of be intrinsic to that once a sort of autonomy is gained. But do you think that after Chauri Chaura, and I guess the villages in his idea would be sort of unified by this morality in some way that's sort of intrinsic. But do you think after Chauri Chaura, like he maybe believed that no more maybe was that morality kind of a part of autonomy, and that autonomy became subordinated to an idea of morality that had to be sort of cultivated or educated, enlightened individualism, a kind of moral developmentalism, and autonomy became subordinate to that, and that can easily sort of be amenable to like nation building discourses in a statist way and taken up by narrow and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I think he had a model. I think his model of the village was always one that needed to be revitalized. So I think it wasn't entirely nostalgic. I mean, he had a model of an older autonomous. He followed Henry Maine in this idea that the village was historically autonomous, and had protected individuals from the incursive, destructive power of the state. So I think he thought that the fact that village society had persisted was a sign of this creative resistance in some form, and could maybe be revitalized. I mean, that I think was the Gandhian and some other sort of Swadeshi understanding of the village, and potential for a decentralized peasant democracy based on these autonomous villages. But so I think even in that model, he always had the sense that the village had to be revitalized because it was not morally, economically, politically autonomous in the way that it had been. And I think in that model, Gandhi always had a much more pedagogic account of a kind of intimate pedagogy, maybe, as opposed to others, where constructive workers had to go inside the village and work in every village and overcome urban-rural divide, overcome elitism, but also is about educating everyone towards self-rule in some form. So I can see how you can, so because as even that I pointed out, there is a way in which the Nehruvian and the Gandhian project can overlap in this pedagogic relationship to the village, but and it could be that it ended up working in a more Nehruvian direction than the Gandhian attempt. But I think the real contradiction there was, I think one of the real contradictions that Gandhi could never quite didn't understand is that he both in a way energized this very large-scale movement, and then expected everyone to go quietly back to the villages in some form. And so there is something about promoting a national agenda and a politics that was national in scale, and then somehow I think he thought that could be could be made compatible with the going back to a kind of simple economic and political structure. I mean, he wanted the Congress to convert to a national, at the independence, he wanted to dissolve and turn it into a national service organization of constructive workers that would go into the village. And so he wanted all political workers to do work of village work. So, that was his ultimate ideal, and I don't know. So I think that's probably a contradiction that Gandhi himself never quite saw, that there was both this push to energize and to have people work across and outwards, and expect a kind of turning inwards in terms of the autonomy and separation of villages too, as the ultimate ideal of ultimately the enlightened individual is, he would say, living alone, I guess.
Did you have a question, Steve? Perhaps the last question?
With the focus largely on Gandhi, the way my mind has been running has been to wonder whether, out of the freshness of your perspective, you've made any surprising discoveries in your own mind about the responses to Gandhi from any of the other protagonists around him in the Congress High Command or its alternatives in the fairly short period after Chauri Chaura and the fast.
Right.
Say, we could say over the following 2 years when they're tearing their hair to figure out, well, what are we going to do as a collective strategy now, or even perhaps up to the events of 1928?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, I think I've always been amazed about how much, Gandhi and Nehru especially were so were intimate, and you can see how intimate in the letters and conversations, but how much Nehru never understood the nature of that decision, and I think really didn't. I mean, he actively disagreed with most of Gandhi's philosophy, but it's amazing to me when you read the letters how much that was never the subject of that. I mean, it's hard to know what they thought they agreed on, given how far apart they were. So that's always been surprising. So clearly Nehru never thought that Nehru always insisted that this was the wrong decision. And in fact, Nehru and almost all, Nehru was easier as a spokesperson because he always was disappointed each time Gandhi had ended disobedience, both in Chauri Chaura, but also the Salt March. So this happened every single time that there was an official calling off. There was some deep disappointment on the part of Nehru. So I think there was some way in which what an end of a decision was for Gandhi was something that most people didn't understand or disagree with. And I think I haven't laid out more of it, but I think this was much more sudden. But I think even post in the Salt Satyagraha and others, Gandhi understood. I think he always thought that you can't keep political momentum forever, and so he thought that you had to come. There was always at the start of any movement, you had to anticipate and think through when you could end it in a way that you could claim victory of some kind, and therefore push towards an iterative solution on the next round. And I think he always was looking for that. That was a part of the project of Satyagraha. You always had to look for what would be the something that looked like a productive compromise, but everyone else, of course, wanted each of those to lead to full independence in some form, and didn't, or something that looked much more like an overt and radical victory than any of them actually did. That's why I think you have people now. Many people can see each of. If you look at the individual campaigns, they never achieved what their individual aim was. I mean, the salt tax wasn't overturned. Rowlatt wasn't overturned. So it feeds this narrative both of trying to figure out what actually what Gandhi understood the purpose of these movements to be, both I think about the power of action and to set up for the next competition in some form, which wasn't the way his. So, to me it's an important and interesting question that never seemed to be resolved. I mean, I don't think Gandhi ever got a straight answer, or Nehru never asked fully, or never got a straight answer. The conversation didn't actually take place in a very obvious way, which I think is pretty interesting. But it's an interesting question. I'll have to think more about it.
Join me in thanking Karuna.
Thank you.